Thank you very much for taking the time to put in your thoughts, because I know, having known quite a lot of you in this room, there's a lot of expertise, and you know why it's important to make our water resource management projects inclusive. Sorry, I just had to run downstairs to get the handouts. That's why I'm huffing and puffing. So people have said, people with limited resources and voice are included and benefited. Sustainable outcomes owned locally, diversity in problem solving to get better solutions, sustainability, increased impact, reach and success, an exemplar for local communities. Okay. That might not be working so well in terms of showing the other answers that people came up with. But thank you for sharing that. And I should mention that all of the inputs you provide today during the session are going to help the AWP to build on already a fantastic suite of resources and support tools that are available to partners, and also take those next steps with the guidance, with the training, with answering your questions and your concerns about how to apply these concepts into practice. So I'm now, instead of doing a PowerPoint, I'm going to point you to a little handout that I created, which is essentially like an intro PowerPoint as a handout. And I just wanted to start with this, this diagram at the top here, which shows the spectrum from JEDC exploitative or harmful through to responsive and accommodating, and then on the far right-hand side to transformative. Now, I'm not going to read out the text there. The text has actually been very finely crafted by Water for Women leaders in terms of trying to create a strong definition around those three categories. And the idea is that our projects can either aim to be exploitative and harmful, which of course none of us want to do, but some projects will exploit inequalities in society, will preference certain power dynamics, inadvertently or intentionally. So we want to move away from that, of course. And in that middle zone is more of a responsive or accommodating approach, which is taking into consideration some of the differences in the power dynamics in our societies and trying to shift them and work with marginalized people. But it may not actually take that next step, which is more of a transformative approach, which is really seeking to leave no one behind and find the people that are most affected and marginalized in our societies and actively support them to shift norms, to shift the way in which we treat certain people in our society, and enable them to be leaders and them to have more than just a voice, but actually actively lead and have influence in our decision-making processes. And that also a transformative approach doesn't just stop at gender equality or disability inclusion. It considers all of the what we call intersectionalities. So looking at sexual gender minorities, looking at cultural, racial, language differences, looking at poverty, all of the ways in which people are impacted by difference, and considering that holistically. So that's the first page. And this sort of framework, or this spectrum, is going to inform AWP's new and improved JEDC guidelines. Now, on the back page, we have a little, essentially like a project cycle of designing, implementing, and monitoring. And it just prompts us to think about, when do we think about gender equality and social inclusion? And we think about it at all stages of a project. I sit on the expert review panel. I look at AWP projects when they come in as proposals through to the final outputs. And often JEDC might be mentioned in terms of, we will consult with some community groups or some stakeholders at that point in the project. And then that's where it's finished. You know, you don't hear about it again. Whereas this is to prompt us all to remember that we need to mainstream it into every element of a project through to that monitoring evaluation, as well as the fact that designing it into those formative design stages are so important, not just consulting with people when we've already designed a project. So on the right-hand side, Water for Women have also created a document which I think has some really pertinent key messages. And if we can all just take these 3 messages away with us today, I think it'd be wonderful. But of course, we're going to hear a lot more from our speakers. So in the face of harmful norms, doing nothing to challenge inequality does harm. Do no harm requires a proactive, not a passive approach. So that's important. Doing nothing is doing harm. A genuine commitment to doing no harm demands that we as development practitioners look at our own conscious and unconscious attitudes and the way in which, and the way we use our own power. The transformative agenda also really looks at the employees or the staff or the people that are the proponents of projects and making sure that we transform ourselves and our own institutions, as well as how we interact with the world. And the third one is it's more constructive to focus on harmful norms as the problem that needs to be changed, not just the groups harmed by these norms. So let's make sure we look at the inequalities and the discrimination itself, not just say we need to engage with women's groups, if you know what I mean. Like, look at what is the inequality in the context you're working in, whose voices are or are not enabled or heard, and then focus on the actual harmful norm. And then at the bottom here are just some key resources. If you Google the title of any of those resources, you'll find them. And I would love to see more projects from our AWP partners reference them and use them in the development of proposals, because it would show that the partner has actually invested a bit of time and energy to understand some of the basic concepts around gender equality, disability, and social inclusion. So there's some great resources there on monitoring evaluation. We've talked in this conference already about the power of data and monitoring evaluation almost being an indicator of what's important. So there are some great resources there around making gender count, leveraging M&E to mainstream gender. That's a CSIRO publication, for instance. So some really relevant ones there. Thank you for that brief overview, engaging with that brief overview, and that's for you to take home. We've got lots of extras as well if you want to take some for your colleagues. And I'm now going to start our process of having 3 fantastic presentations, 10 minutes each, and then we're going to move into a very practical session, brainstorming, which is, as I said, the information you provide in those practical brainstorming and question and answer sessions will help feed into AWP thinking about where to from here with supporting the network. So first of all, we're going to hear from Kristen Knight and Julie Muka, who are from Yarra Valley Water. And please come to the stage. Thank you.
Making sure I can use the clicker. So good morning. I'm Kristen. If I haven't had the chance to meet many of you, I'm from Yarra Valley Water. I'm an engineer by trade. I've got with me Julie, who comes from the world of people, performance and culture, and we work together on a twinning program with an Indonesian water utility. So we were partnered with a utility based in Bali, in the beautiful Gianyar. So they were initially called Pidam Gianyar. They changed their name partway through the program to the far more unpronounceable Titwa Sanjuani, but I'm learning. And they are situated around the beautiful Ubud region of Bali. And it was a real privilege to work with them. And we started out with a technical twinning program. And then there was sort of, and we're going to try including a Jessie lens to this program, which was music to my ears. I'll roll out my soapbox. I'm an engineer in a male-dominated industry and a female leader. Here we go. And then I very quickly realised that my soapbox might not have been culturally appropriate. So I rolled it away. And like a true engineer, we stuck to the engineering to start with. So our key focus areas for the technical component of our twinning program were non-revenue water, so unaccounted for water, asset management, and water safety were the focus areas we chose to work on. And when we sort of started this program, we had a technical action plan, and then we started building a Jessie action plan. And what we quickly realised was it was far easier and beneficial to all of us to weave the two together. And then that was how we progressed. Otherwise, we felt we had two somewhat unmanageable beasts to try and wrangle through a fairly short program. So, and through this program, we built some beautiful relationships, and that was really where we were able to weave our Jessie into the technical. It was really started as a lot of technical conversations and technical sessions in really formal settings, and through sharing and learning about our technical problems and building those relationships, we were able to open the door to have those far more challenging and culturally challenging conversations around gender equality and social inclusion. Julie's going to give you more detail on the outcomes and the challenges that we faced through the Jessie program. But I had three key takeaways that I learned through this program in a non-technical sense. The first one was that it took only one really incredible Balinese woman in the program to drive incredible change. She's in all those photos there, the one called Drury, also called Julie. And just the power of one person was astounding to me. Secondly, we started this program in the second half of 2019. So COVID severely interrupted our program, and online Zoom meetings is an incredibly poor substitute for being in country or having them here with us to have those really meaningful, engaged conversations. Zoom was very formal. It was really challenging to really get to the crux of what was going on. And the third one was that in both a technical and a Jessie sense, working together on understanding why we do things rather than pulling to the what and how we're going to do it. If you haven't understood the why and if you don't embed the why, you don't get a sustained change. I'll hand over to Julie.
Thanks, Kristen. And so, as Kristen said, I came into the program, I guess, late to the piece. So the technical work had started, and Kristen had the joy of being able to go to Bali and see the workplace. But I was called in as HR, and you would help change the world around creating an inclusive culture. What I discovered really quickly is that there's so many challenges around that, particularly in Indonesia. So things like the language, obviously, to call that out straight up, that the language was incredibly difficult to navigate the connection. The cultural differences as well, very much in Bali. There was also the issue around finances and resourcing. So as Kristen mentioned, having Julie on the program, she's one person in the organisation trying to change the culture, basically. We also had the issues, as Kristen mentioned, around technology and COVID. But I guess for me, the main thing, I guess I got brought in and we were sent off to Jakarta, which is where the photos on the left and the bottom were taken. And it was really about trying to build trust and using our, I guess, non-verbal skills to build that trust. Creating a relationship before you get into sort of the nitty-gritty of trying to change a culture is really important. And I was fortunate that Kristen had done a lot of the groundwork for me. And then once I was able to connect with our partner, it was really about listening and hearing about what's their world like? How can I offer any value if I don't understand what their world's like? So the reality of working through some, actually, I might move into some of the challenges, is that we weren't going to change the world. Right, so one person, a couple of technical people from Yarra Valley Water, we weren't going to change the world. But what I did set out to do is trying to make some small incremental changes. And that came through educating. So we were really lucky that Tertis and Joanni were able to come to our Mitcham offices in Melbourne. And the first thing we did was we got our MD out front and centre. So we got our MD out to talk through the Yarra Valley Water journey around diversity and inclusion and looking at that broader lens before we focused directly into gender. And our MD spent a lot of time with the MD of Church San Giovanni. And he was, and that's the bottom photo, you can see him handing over some gifts to our visitors. And really, I guess he was able, the MD of Church San Giovanni was able to really see the culture, inclusive culture, come to life. To really see it in action. And the benefits of having that gender equality in an organisation. So then from there, we were able to actually put together some action plans. And one of the first things that we were looking for is what some of the tangible things that can happen straight away on the ground. But before we were able to actually get there, the organisation needed to understand who they were. So going into some of our achievements, the first thing as an HR professional, when I was talking to them is, well, who is your organisation? What's the makeup of your organisation? What's the demographics? And it sounds really basic and simplistic, but in a country like Indonesia, it doesn't exist. They don't know. They don't know who their people are. They don't know the demographics of their people. So one of the first things we were able to achieve is to do a diversity survey and understand the makeup of the organisation. And that then allowed us to lean in to where there were perhaps gaps or opportunities for improvement. And I think it talks to what Melita was talking a little bit about in terms of data, understanding the data in order to influence your actions. So we did that. So we did a workforce survey, again, challenging because you're working in an environment from a technology perspective where, you know, the organisation is connecting in with their people through WhatsApp. So that's very different to how we operate in Australia. But we were able to get good take-up. And some of our questions around diversity were quite intrusive from a culture perspective. So we had to be really mindful of that. But we did achieve it, and we got incredible results in terms of really understanding the organisation. The next thing we did from there is we were able to target specific recruitment campaigns to increase the number of women in the organisation. So what we identified really quickly is that we had a lot of engineering qualified women that were doing administrative jobs. So the first thing we did was talk about, well, how do we change that? I mean, these people in your organisation that are educated and ready to step into engineering jobs, but they need the opportunity. So there were a number of recruitment campaigns that they rolled out at the local level to increase women's participation in technical and leadership roles. And then the third thing that they had a real win with was the work they did with community. So the photo at the top was Church San Giovanni celebrating International Women's Day, which was a first for them. And they did it with community. And that had, you know, I guess from a benefit perspective, it's twofold. There was benefit to staff, seeing the value that women bring to the organisation, but also for community to see that, hey, in the water sector, they value women. And it might be actually a good place to work. So it's opening up a whole nother opportunity there in terms of as an employer of choice. So that was something that we had a real win with and unheard of in Bali. But it wasn't all one way. So there was plenty of achievements from the Church San Giovanni side. From a Yarra Valley Water perspective, we also learnt, so being in the HR space, I also look after our industrial relations side and our enterprise agreement. And what I realised is that in Bali, they're far more, I guess, advanced and progressive around how they treat women's issues and leave associated. And so what we were able to do was learn from them and put some of those concepts into our enterprise agreement, so we made some policy change at the local level for us as well, which is a really big achievement. And I guess, you know, from a water industry perspective, our agreement's now one of the most progressive in Victoria. So pretty satisfied, but I wouldn't have seen that if I wasn't part of the project. And so, you know, leaving you with this last slide, you know, I think for us, we made friendships, we built connections, and I would say that whilst we're still in the water industry, we would hope to maintain those ongoing. But these aren't easy issues to unpack. And, you know, going into to create an inclusive culture, it takes time and it takes deliberate effort, and you need to work on it one step at a time. But yeah, it's been a really incredible experience for both of us. And we thank AWP for giving that to us. Thanks. Thanks, Mike.
wonderful example of how you've built trust, used data, and also the role of champions within the organisations that you worked with and really supporting and enabling them. I think there's just so many great practices from that example. Thank you for sharing that, both of you. And so happy that you're getting to continue that partnership and those connections long term. Also, I noticed that in the previous session, there was a focus on two-way exchange, knowledge exchange, and just what you said about the fact that you've transformed your own organisation, your own enterprise agreement as a result of that collaboration is definitely an example of that more transformative change at the end of the spectrum. I was talking about changing our own institutions and our own ways of working at the same time as working with and supporting others. So thank you for that great example. Now we have Dr. Len Drury from Aqua Consultants. He's done a lot of work for AWP. He's going to share some insights. Thank you, Len.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, so don't get the wrong impression, I think GSDI is very important, but there are lots of challenges involved when you're actually working in so many countries. So I want to give a spectrum. In the 1980s, actually in Myanmar, we actually did a proxy sort of GSI, although we didn't know what it was. Aqua Consultants is very much involved with GSDI, and to give an example, all our board management it's equal male and female, because there's two of us. So I passed, don't we? We passed for that. The most important things, if I can work this out, let's see how we go. That's not it. Thank you. Is the first thing is get the water resources right. Once you've got the water resources right, we can then proceed with GDSI and then design and budget. Now, quite often we have to compromise. Once we know what the water supply is and we have a community consultation, not everyone is happy and compromise is required. And when you go to a country, I mean, it could be due to, you've got to consider ethnicity and religion and geology and hydrogeology and topography, the role of women in society, the government, sometimes democratic, sometimes military. So everything's different. Every country is different. And I'll give you some examples of Mongolia, Myanmar, and also Pakistan. Now, we are guests of the country. We have to respect that country and their history, their culture. And change takes a long time to take place. It's important that consultants are in country for not 1 day or 1 hour, but years for change to take place. Now, to put your picture, groundwater is highly valued but highly misunderstood. And most project managers, I would say, and social people do not understand the concept of groundwater resources, location extraction. So the top priority, first of all, is to get the water right. And then after that, we can then do GDSI and for community consultation. I forgot to put the slide on. So groundwater is about 30% of all potable water. And surface water globally is 1.2%. But with all the floods, you sort of don't realise that. But so I'm going to concentrate on groundwater work. So if we look at Myanmar, this is very typically Myanmar in the centre part, and the geology is on the left-hand side. No one builds their village on floodplains, and there's a reason for that. And I think sometimes Australia should note that there are reasons for people not building on floodplains. Everyone lives on the hills, so we need to do water supply to the hills. Hydrogeology is on the right-hand side. The blue is sandstones with high yield, low salinity. So if we look at this area here, the Shimatong Range is on this side here. Highly salty groundwater, but all the villages live up there. So what we have to do, we have to drill in the high yield, low salinity area, and then we have a 10-kilometre pipeline going up to the village. Quite often we have a lack of budget to put a pipeline in, but we save women walking 8 to 10 kilometres to get water. So we partially have a tick off for some social issues, but once we get to the village, there are other complications which I'll come to in a second. Another example, this is the Eastern Highlands, Shan State. Eastern Shan State is where the Golden Triangle area is, illicit drug dealings. And this book has just been finished, sponsored by AWP. If you look down where the pink area is, that's all granites. So regardless if you have ethnic minorities there, if you have poverty-stricken people there, you can't get water there in the gravities. But the blue is high yield, low salinity. So where the blue is the hills, you get huge volumes of groundwater just discharging out 4 or 5 megalitres a day, just pouring out, that we can take and use for village water supplies and town water supplies. So different parts of the country has different water resources. So if we just look at this, it's not true that men don't collect water. In the dry zone, the men get the oxen, because the oxen and farming is a man's responsibility. So they would use their oxen to collect water in the afternoon after being in the field all day and take it home to their village, because that's simple, it's inside the village. But of course, women have to go and do the long distance hauling. But the lady on the right looks pretty happy, because we're just taking a photo of her. But it depends where you are. Look, as I said, in a military environment, the military decides where the tube well is. The military decides where that water supply is going to go. If you are a village the military likes, because you're doing the right thing, you'll get a water supply. If you don't, you won't get a water supply. Now, the local authorities, they are appointed by the military, and they will put their water supply system where they want it to go. Now, religion, in the Buddhist religion, it's great to give water. You get credit points for giving water. So I've got 10,000 of credit points. But as a Buddhist, you respect the Saya, you respect the teacher, so you respect the Buddhist monk. So if you have a community meeting and the Buddhist monk is there, if he says, let's put it in the monastery, because it's actually common land, it's actually public access land. Now, no one is going to say to the Buddhist monk, that's not going to happen, because he will lose face. And in Myanmar, losing face is a critical thing. Quite often, the Buddhist monk will say, this is where it's going. And that's where it will go, because that is showing respect to the sea. Ethnicity. Once again, it doesn't matter where you are, you've got to go where the water supply is. And a lot of people, if you're, say, the Kachin race, which is northeast Myanmar, or the Karen race, who've been fighting the Burmese for 60 years, they're mainly Christian. And you go to their villages and you can talk to their whole community, and they will have a equal male-female discussion. Refugee camps. There's lots of internally displaced people's camps. And the NGOs work with the women, because the women occupy most of the IDP, because the men are out shooting each other. And so within refugee camps, there's actually a really good female gender consultation with the NGOs. The NGOs are fantastic people in these environments. And insurgency, some of my great friends are insurgents. They're actually wonderful, wonderful people. Just in the wrong place at the wrong time. We go to Mongolia. Now, Mongolia is simple because the women are trained by the Russians and they take on responsibility. This lady up here, who's got the veil up, is the chairman of the River Basin Committee. And so they go out in the field with you and they have the government authority. They carry that authority with them. So they can make decisions on the spot. So if we want to do water supply, they get a community. The community says where they want it, and this woman approves it on the spot. We don't go through a few months of waiting for people to make autocratic decisions. It's that made on the spot. So Mongolia is a fantastic place to actually get community consultation. At the other extreme, this is Baluchistan. And my wife, we spent 3 years here, but it actually is a very, very difficult location. This is not the Punjab area. This is the very western area near Afghanistan and Iran. In fact, we drilled on the border of Afghanistan. We drilled on the border of Iran. And our first drill site, the rig mast went up and the Iranians suddenly appeared on the other side with armored personnel carriers because it looked like a missile launcher. So we do learn from our mistakes. But this is a place where, for example, when you go to a village, the women all run into their houses and close the doors with their girls because a foreigner is in the town. Or when in a court case, two men's witness is good, alternatively, one man and two women. Or where a man can have 4 wives, but a wife cannot have 4 men. Or for adultery, the woman gets stoned to death, the man gets forgiven. Or when you go to the house of a person, a male family, you sit with the man and have dinner, women are in the kitchen, and they have what's left after. So I can go on and on. This is the place where Shias blow up Sunnis and whatever. But what is here, this is my counterpart. His uncle is a warlord in Helmand province. No one's going to touch me because he's my counterpart. The other guy is Muhammad Ali, who actually is one of the heads of the Baluchistan Liberation Army. These are the guys who make the decisions. There's no consultation. And if you want NGOs to go into this area, no vaccination by the polio vaccination, 70 people have been killed. The imams have told them that we're actually sterilising their women. So this is the extreme, okay? But there's other areas like Somalia and similar situations. The other thing is that this is a fault line here. It doesn't matter if you're on top of the hill or below the hill. That's the fixed location of your water supply, regardless where the any ethnic minorities are or the poverty-stricken people. That is where your water supply goes, because that's where the fault line is. This is Quetta. In 1930, 60,000 people got killed in an earthquake. Thanks. Okay, just what I'm going to do is that, but it's not all lost. It's not all lost. This is an example of a military design water supply. Of course, old people can't get down. A kilometre from the village. The men get down there, have their wash. The women can wash. That woman here, she can wash inside herself. But if you're old, if you have disabilities, you can't access this. So you have to pay money to get back there. But there's also some great examples. All the thousands of springs are developed and water supply is brought by gravity to the villages. And this one here is a great example. right, they get power, and the rest of the water goes to 2,000 hectares of irrigation for this village. So there is hope, but every country is different and every community is different, and not one solution fits all. Thank you.
Very much, Len. You've definitely worked in some very interesting and challenging contexts. And yeah, the key message of different places are different, definitely. But there are ways to get really great information about how to support local change agents within each of those contexts and take their lead. I think that Bob's talk this morning about disability was really extremely important. And as you just pointed out there, the infrastructure and how it is created without thought about people with disabilities, a range of disabilities. You could see some of the standpipes there and the other types of infrastructure. I spoke to a woman in Vanuatu recently. She's a leader of a social change program. And she said, if we just designed everything with a woman in a wheelchair in mind, we would actually address the needs of a lot of the population, not all, but just think about, can a woman in a wheelchair safely, accessibly use this infrastructure? And then you're already starting to go down the right path in terms of design. But you mentioned a lot of other issues there around reaching people and voice, very, very pertinent. And I think that Dr. Pichamon Yopatong is going to tell us some really great things about her research and some ideas about how to work in challenging environments. Thank you very much. Oh, I should mention as well, sorry, Dr. Pichamon is on the expert review panel as well for the AWP and is from Uni New South Wales. Please come up, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today, to AWP for organizing this wonderful event. I am an academic, and that means different things to different people, but generally speaking, when it comes to a practitioner community, it means that we don't really get our hands dirty in the same way that Len does, for instance. And I am going to preface my remarks by saying that this is based on the research that I have done. It is based on a lot of interviews and group discussions with a range of stakeholders across Southeast Asia as well as China. And it basically concerns projects that I'm involved in that seek to empower environmental human rights offenders, many of whom are women in this region. And so some of the insights I'll be sharing with you today are derived from the accounts that I've been able to gain from interviewees and from stakeholders, but they're also based on my own personal experiences of being part of consultation meetings, dialogues, and workshops, much like this one, but also much more locally driven as well. So I guess let me start, well, I've already started, but let me give you just a quick anecdote that really, to me, kind of signaled the gravity of the situation and the issues that we face when we start thinking about social inclusion. And to also realize that it doesn't stop when your project stops, right? It continues. And if you want to have a positive impact, it's about thinking in the long term about kind of the ongoing impact that your work will have or can have on the community. And so this was part of a project I was involved in back in 2020, shortly before COVID struck. And I was conducting fieldwork in Laos. As part of that fieldwork, I had the privilege to speak to one really amazing female lawyer who was working with communities to ensure that their environmental rights, specifically when it came to water, were being safeguarded. And so over the course of that conversation, the same old issues kind of popped up, right? That women don't really have a lot of voice. You don't really see them visible in these meetings that we have, and so on and so forth. So that bit, whilst insightful and important to our project, is not actually the focus of this anecdote. What is the focus of this anecdote, though, is what happened afterwards. So after that particular conversation, she got in touch with me and then started telling me kind of off the record and asking me whether I could help her with this particular predicament she found herself in. And that predicament involved her having visited a community in Laos, in rural Laos, where they still practiced this rite of passage, where young girls, upon reaching puberty, would be put in a hut, and men would go and visit that hut at night to inaugurate her into womanhood. Basically rape, right? And so the question that this particular female lawyer had for me was, what can I do to help? Do you have any connections, any networks that we could actually go in and help this community? Obviously, it was above and beyond the scope of work that I was given, the terms of reference. But of course, you cannot help but care about what happens in that situation. And if we start thinking about it in a much more systematic way, then obviously this speaks to the range of issues that you find, particularly in a country like Laos, where you have a diversity of ethnic minorities, each of whom have their own traditions, their cultural practices, some of which may very well raise eyebrows in our societies today. But so to me, the reason why I started with that is because it does make you really think about, what am I doing and what can I do more? Again, engagement doesn't stop when your project finally publishes that MEL framework, or when you have that JETC policy. You have real world impact in that regard. And so looking through more than 100 in-depth interviews that I've conducted, again, with a variety of stakeholders across the region, I thought for the kind of simplicity, in order to simplify things, I might just summarize the top 3 issues that kept reoccurring over the course of these conversations. And these, again, probably won't be very surprising to you, but nonetheless, I hope they can serve as a departure point for our conversations today. So the first top 3 complaint that I received, and this I have to say is irrespective of the country or the context. The first one is that gender responsive and social inclusion strategies become a mere box ticking exercise. I mean, I need to get some nods around here. Who here feels like the word JETC is overused, is somewhat of an empty signifier at times, and really has quite limited impact when you go and do the work that you do, right? So I see some nodding heads there. But certainly this is the perception of JETC when I speak to local stakeholders in Southeast Asia in particular. They're very open about how they feel that this is very much a nice sounding term, but they have no idea what it means in actual practice. The other common complaint relating to that that I often came across was that the focus is more on quantity rather than on quality. It's on meeting metrics, not on actually having impact in a positive or transformative way. And so really, for those who are really frustrated with the concept of JETC, to them, the focus has been more on kind of meeting certain requirements in terms of what gender means, as opposed to actually understanding the power relationships that underlie the gender relationships that we really should be focusing on instead. It's also the case that I came across many accounts of where you have experts from Australia or elsewhere that would fly in and fly out, fly into a community and then fly out the next day. And there were some really interesting, if not slightly concerning accounts where these experts came in, they walked around, they said, oh, there's no women in this village. And then they left and it was like, no JETCs needed, really, because there are no women. The reality, though, was that the women were either hiding and kind of Len spotlighted that problem, or it was that the women were actually working or looking after their children at the time when the consultation or the meeting was supposed to take place. It's also the case that I've been to, and this is not a water context, but a different kind of sector altogether. We were talking about sexual harassment. And we were talking to these managers about, what it means to be gender sensitive, to be not sexist. They said all the right words, but then they ended the interview by making a really bad sexist joke, right? And it's like, this is what we do in our culture, which is, okay, understandable, but it also demonstrates that there are limits to the immediate internalization of a lot of these norms, concepts, principles that we bring from Australia into these other countries. And so this really kind of links into my second point and the second top complaint that I came across over the course of my interviews, which is that diversity is seen. It might be seen at the negotiating table, at the consultation table, but not everyone's opinions will always matter. Not everyone's opinions will be treated equally, and not everyone's contributions will be perceived as being of equal value. And just to give you my own personal experience, when some colleagues found out that I had joined the AWP's advisory committee, one of them, who works actually in the JEDC sector, responded to me by saying, so you must be the token female, Asian female that now makes up the AWP advisory committee. Now, it could very well be in jest, right? Nonetheless, it does reflect that issue, that it's about perception as well, and the perceptions that we bring in when we engage or host these consultations and meetings. And so a lot of the women in the communities that I speak to often say that they get invited, but they're not really heard. And so they might end up just sitting at the back of the table, or they're sitting by the side, and no one really cares to ask them or to formulate targeted questions that ask for their opinion and their insights. And this is part of the problem, right? Because we don't want to put people on the spot, but at the same time, if you don't do that, then we just end up replicating the status quo as well. The third point, and I know that I'm quickly running out of time, is of course the difficulty of mapping intersectional considerations onto development programming as well as onto MEL frameworks. And of course, there is no framework that can accurately capture the complexity of intersectional considerations. But of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I've come across many very good programs that have their hearts in the right place that ultimately, in one sense, give up because they say that with project timeframes being so tight as they are, with metrics being so demanding as they are, we just have to be realistic and be aware that we can't do everything all the time. And whilst that's completely understandable, it does raise some issues, to me at least, because you're going into another community, you're bringing certain concerns to light, you're raising a lot of issues that may well jeopardize some of the people who take part in those consultations and meetings. But then when you say that, our consultation period has ended, you leave. What does that mean for the women who are already put in under the spotlight or who are viewed as leaders in their communities, but don't actually have the resources to continue playing that role? And so again, I'm very aware that I've quickly run out of time, but if I may just very quickly kind of sum up some of the practical steps that I've come across and which I've seen have worked, even though they're very simple, right? So the first one, conducting a gender sensitive political economy analysis. That seems really commonsensical, right? And yet so many of the tenders I've seen when it comes to PEA still focus just on the traditional PEA. Gender does not come at the very front when we consider who has access to political power or who are the gatekeepers when it comes to these issues. And it also needs to be noted that these gender sensitive PEAs shouldn't be conducted just for gender related programming. They should be conducted for all sorts of development programming. The second point is that when it comes to practice, it's the little things that matter to the big picture as well. It's about the time of the meetings that you arrange. It's about asking specific questions that will empower the people in the room. It's also about the things like, who do you bring in as your interpreter when you're speaking to a local community who cannot communicate in English? All of these things can have impact on the political asymmetries within the room, but can also incentivize certain people to speak and others to remain silent. And then the third point about MEL frameworks, and I know there is at least one expert on that in this room now, but I guess my point is just simply frameworks can only go so far, right? At the end of the day, we're all humans implementing these programs, hoping for there to be positive change. And so I guess to me, fundamentally, some of the best programs that I've seen that are not just gender responsive, but possibly even transformative are the ones where the people involved actively ask themselves, why do I care? What are my biases? What are my assumptions? But at the end of the day, why do I want to affect change? What kind of outcomes do I personally want to see? And I know that that can be difficult when you're operating within a donor-driven context, but nonetheless, again, we need to also ensure that our agency is respected and protected in all of this. And so let me end by just saying that at the end of the day, all of this does also relate to our own assumptions fundamentally about what we think is right, what we think is appropriate. And far too often when I go into a meeting with experts in the room from a variety of countries, they go in and they start analyzing the situation in the country by saying, it's an authoritarian regime, there's no hope. Or, this is an entirely misogynistic social system. We can't reason with them. We have to go in and we need to tell them what's right and what they need to do better. And of course, needless to say, that's not going to be extremely helpful, because what you want to have happen first is the dialogue, right? And so I guess I'll end on that note, which is that, again, most of what I've said here today won't come as a surprise to anyone here. But I do think that it's high time for us to seriously reconsider not just the nature of the language that we use, but rather the practices that we implement, but also what these practices mean to us, and also what our organizations are doing within our organizations to ensure as a first step that social inclusion, gender inclusion are being respected and mainstreamed into how we think and how we practice. Thank you.
I think we need to write that up and publish on the AWP website, yeah? And such concrete points that you made there about what can be done better, as well as we understand the problem to an extent, but really those concrete issues that stakeholders have told you about the practice they've observed. Those sorts of reflections back to us is so important. So thank you for sharing that today. Okay, well, now we're going to move into some group discussions. And we've got 3 topics that we're going to ask you to talk about on 3 tables. So do you think we need